Hey everybody, how's it going? So today we're going to actually talk about different aspects of problem solving, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail and go into some problem solving techniques beyond just Hirakawa. So earlier we talked about problem solving, and mostly Hirakawa was the problem solving thing. Now we're going to problem solving and talk about some additional techniques that are offered in your textbook. So yeah, these are, problem solving techniques. And the first one there is the is not analysis. And with this technique, basically, you're just talking about what is part of the problem and what is part of the cause, and making sure that when you're looking at the problem, it is indeed the problem and not you're not veering into the cause. So that's the distinction there for that one. And then the journalist 6 questions is the next technique. Basically, you might remember this if any of you ever took journalism in high school, or if you ever, well, I don't know, if you maybe took a journalism class here, you might remember it. But it's the who, what, where, why, when, and how. Those 6 questions that are typically, usually in the first paragraph of a journalist article or a newspaper article. And this next one is often referred to as the PERT technique. I used to call it's also known as an action chart, and we in this class we actually also call it the dividing up the topic, and that is basically where you just have a chart of who's going to do what, and you remember turning those into me. But different names for the same thing. The PERT technique is another name for it. And PERT stands for Program Evaluation Review Technique. So there it is. The next one is called force field analysis. This was actually invented by Kurt Lewin, who's considered by a lot of people to be the father of group dynamics. And you have driving forces and restraining forces, basically, with this technique. The driving forces are the things that are helping your group or team, and then the restraining forces are the things that are maybe stopping you. So, things that are helping or driving forces may be, people's motivation to pass the class. Restraining forces might be things like, illness or something like that. The fishbone technique, basically this fishbone diagram divides up the difference between the causes and the effects. So it looks at the difference between causes and effects when analyzing a problem. And it's called the fishbone technique because of the diagram there. And if you'll see that the bones sometimes represent, each bone coming out can be considered to be a cause, and the center bone is the effect. The T-chart is basically where you talk about the pros and cons of doing something. And this is really useful because a lot of times groups, if they want to do something really badly, they'll only look at the advantages and the pros, and they don't consider the cons. And the flip side of that is they don't really consider, they only look at they either only look at the advantages or only look at the disadvantages, or they only look at the pros, or they only look at the cause. And in this case, this T chart, you just write a big T on the board and put pros and cons on either side, and you end up making sure that you cover both of those. So it kind of reminds people to look at everything, because everything has pros and cons, right? But hopefully the things we actually decide to do are the things that have a lot of pros. The ideal solution, what this technique is basically what the group does is while they're talking about different solutions that are out there, they ask, like, in an ideal world, what would be ideal? And this gets everybody on the same page. Of course, it's not an ideal world. Like, for example, if resources weren't an issue, if money was unlimited, what would we do? Obviously, that's never really the case. But that just helps the group kind of see if they're on the same page. Because I've had some groups, for example, in my classes where they're like, oh yeah, if money wasn't an issue, we'd have all our meetings in Hawaii. And then later you realize that one group member doesn't like Hawaii and doesn't like sand or doesn't like the beach or whatever. So what we think is ideal is not necessarily ideal, but that's the idea, is to take out all those barriers and see what would be ideal, and that helps the group check in to see if they're all on the same page. The next thing is called the single question technique. And this basically, what groups do is they encounter a lot of questions. It's just normal. What this does is it says, what is the one question that's the most important question? We have a ton of unknowns. Whenever you're in a group, you have like a ton of things that you just don't know. Like, so what, for example, you don't know if there's going to be an earthquake on the day of your presentation. You just don't know. But what's the one question that we need to know the most? And try to find that answer as opposed to focusing on all these other questions. So it kind of helps them kind of zone in on those most important questions. The nominal group technique is basically the group is submitting their ideas in advance of the meeting. And it's usually on paper, typically. They write their answers down, sometimes anonymously, sometimes not. But that's the idea, is to get the ideas down in advance. It says here, the nominal group technique is the procedure that uses some of the principles and methods of active brainstorming. It has the members write their ideas while being quiet and thinking before sharing them with the group. Introverts will prefer using this nominal group technique. So it gets people to share in writing their ideas prior to the meeting or right at the very beginning of the meeting. And then usually the group leader will read those ideas out, either anonymously or not so anonymously. The Delphi technique is basically the same thing, but it's done with emails. A lot of times those emails are anonymous again. But the emails, as opposed to just writing down on paper during the meeting, people will email it in before the meeting or email it in right at the very beginning of the meeting if it's a remote meeting. Anonymously a lot of times, sometimes not. Affinity technique. This is basically where people write their ideas down on post-it notes, little post-it notes, and then it allows you to kind of arrange the ideas with the post-it notes and see the relation amongst those things and how much affinity those ideas have towards each other. And in fact, now the post-it note companies start to make giant post-it notes as a result of this, which you will see sometimes, but you could use just regular post-it notes to do it. And then the electronic brainstorming is basically, again, it's like the Delphi method, but maybe using some kind of a software package to send in their ideas electronically. And then reverse brainstorming, this is not a very common technique, but it is kind of fun to think of the worst solution to a problem. Like, what's the worst thing we could possibly do in this scenario? And this is, again, just to check in with people and to see if you're all on the same page about what would be the worst technique, because you might not actually agree. And if you do disagree, you can discuss it and come up with an understanding of where everybody is at. So yeah, those are some additional brainstorming techniques that are out there. Let me know if you have any questions about this. I'm always happy to try and help out and help you understand the different types of techniques that are out there. But as a manager, like having different techniques and having more techniques is a good idea. Or even if you're just a group member, just having additional ways to get things done and thinking about different approaches. And this, just using different techniques is more likely to increase the critical thinking. So a lot of groups, will fall into a rut, and these a lot of times will get them out of the rut. Okay, have a great day.